by the Idaho Statesman, they are reporting that public money on the case exceeds $8 million. $8 million spent on Bryan Kohberger and his defense and his trial overall.
Fiscal authorization, $100,000 per year. That's the actual line item that sat inside a sealed civil case file in North Idaho, a budget line for a man who confessed to killing 4 college students and never once faced a jury. Picture a vault. Not a courtroom. A vault bolted shut, sitting inside a courthouse, and the only people with the combination are the defendant's own lawyers. That's what we're opening today. Before we go deeper into what the documents actually show, make sure you're subscribed to Audit the Case, because we don't just cover the story.
There was no trial, but his case, I guess I should say. Kohberger, remember, admitted to killing Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogen, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle in Moscow, Idaho. Something that stands out about that figure, more than $8 million, is that, again, there was not even a trial. When you would hear a figure like that, you would think like, oh, and a big long trial. Remember, there wasn't even a trial because Kohberger pled guilty. He admitted to this, and there never was a trial. Remember, Kohberger could not afford his own legal defense.
Never reached a single day of trial testimony. He pleaded guilty. 4 consecutive life sentences. No appeal. And yet the bill kept climbing long after the gavel came down.
So taxpayers are the ones who paid $8 million, and his defense alone out of that $8 million, just the defense was $5.5 million. And that number is still rising even at that moment, which it's interesting to think about. Would his defense have actually been cheaper had he been able to hire a private attorney? Because remember, he had public defender because he couldn't afford a private attorney. But even like a high-profile private attorney, I'm told, may have cost somewhere around $1 million for the case. Even if it was more, it would still be significantly less than, the millions and millions and millions of dollars in taxpayer money.
Preparing for a trial that was canceled at the last possible moment. Sit with that gap for a second. A guilty plea is supposed to be the cheap ending. It's the version of the story where the system saves money, saves time, saves the public from a drawn-out spectacle. Here it did the opposite. The plea didn't close the books. It just closed the courtroom. The financial paper trail kept running underneath, in a file the public was never supposed to see. That file has a name, sort of. It's technically a civil case, stapled to the criminal one.
And it's closer to 8.1, but give or take there. I guess the thing to take away though is we don't actually, those are identifiable costs. And so with the prosecution, for instance, we're not including things like the salaries of the prosecutors, because those are salaries that would be paid anyway, but it's just the hours that and time they're putting toward it. Other items that are not included are any FBI costs. The FBI keeps that information close to the vest. They don't reveal anything with regards to any of their operations, and they view that as giving away some of those details. There's also no court fees or costs included in there as well, because the Idaho court system doesn't assign specific costs, something like the judge's salary or the bailiffs or the court reporter. They don't include that specific to a defendant, even though we know there likely were heightened costs for the court system tied to this particular case, including additional security and things like that during hearings like the sentencing hearing and the change of plea hearing, which you and I were both at. So those are not included and baked in, but otherwise, yes, the total all in is about 8.1.
$8.1 million. That's what Idaho taxpayers have paid, identifiably, for the prosecution and defense of Bryan Kohberger. A case that never reached a verdict, never reached a jury.
Yes, actually. So about $5.5 million was what the defense expenditures included. And we know that those are for the attorneys themselves, but also for all the expert witnesses and the investigators and all the work that was done as they were building toward trial, which obviously didn't happen. But yeah, all in. And I know that cost is firm. We know that roughly 5.5. And what's interesting about that is that Latah County was actually responsible for, it would have been all of it, but it ended up being about half. And I'll explain that in a moment. And then there was the creation of a state public defender's office in the state of Idaho. It transitioned. There was a new state law that switched it from a county-based system where they fund the defense for someone like an indigent defendant like Bryan Kohberger, and then it transitioned at the halfway mark, and so the state basically ended up picking up the bill. So Idaho or Latah County spent about $2.75 million for Bryan Kohberger's defense, and then that transitioned then over on the state side in the lead up to trial. And then as he pled, and there's been some residual costs and some different things, some billing, they paid about 2.67.
$5.5 million of that $8 million went to his defense alone. The lawyers, the experts, the investigators, all.
Yeah, and then the thing to take into mind, and I include this in my story, but I explain that there have been lots of research studies, mostly through academia, but for the neighboring states in Oregon and Washington, which both used to have the death penalty, neither do anymore. But there have been studies that show consistently, on average, a capital case, a death penalty case, just to pursue it costs at least $1 million more. So had they gone to trial and had there been a conviction and then a jury was weighing whether or not to sentence him to death. And, beyond that, the other thing that comes from that, we have all the appeals that generally come up. And so when he pled guilty, he waived his right to appeal, in part in exchange for removing the death penalty. And he was obviously sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences plus some years for the burglary charge. But you're adding even additional cost if you actually go through with a trial, and then also all that appeal process, which, I mean, that can get into tens of millions more. We have a prisoner here in Idaho who's been on death row for almost 50 years. And I have anecdotally been told it's difficult to assign a cost to it, but I've been told that case has cost the state tens of millions of dollars over those years. So, the kind of untold costs ultimately, but again, we landed at 8 million here, and then roughly most of that is for the defense, 5.5.
With no appeal pending and no future trial to protect, then what exactly is still being protected? Whose interest does silence serve once the case is closed? The judge sided with the newspaper. The file started to open, and
Do we know how much his lawyers made, like Ann Taylor? Were you able to break that down?
I was to some extent, and I think we're going to get into a legal effort that
Yes. Yeah.
myself and my newspaper are involved in to get more information, including that. But from when it was in that county-based system, it was running through this resource judge and this sealed case file where his attorneys had to invoice and get approvals through a judge. And again, I think we'll get.
the lead public defender was paid $485,000 for roughly the final 18 months of the case alone. And she's still billing the state in a reduced role, even while opposing the release of records about her own.
How much the University of Idaho had spent also, I mean, more than $1 million.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, it was approaching 2. So the number that I landed on was about $1.71 million. And that dates to the very beginning of the case. And so that included, primarily it was about ramped up security. So they then brought in Idaho State Police troopers to do additional patrols around the campus and even the extended community area. And so they had to backfill that money. It was about $241,000 that they paid Idaho State Police for essentially overtime. But then they did a big security review plan with a private firm. That I'm kind of jogging my memory, but I believe that was somewhere in the like $350,000 range that they paid for that. And then they were paying for a private security firm themselves. And then they were also paying for overtime for their own campus security. So that all totaled a little bit more than $1 million. And then you had things like
The University of Idaho spent close to $1.7 million. Security patrols.
Interesting in your article that stood out to me. It's a small number compared to everything else, but I just thought it was interesting because I travel all the time, that the prosecutor's office got stuck with a $16,400 non-refundable fee for lodging it reserved in Boise once the case was moved out of Moscow for trial. And then I guess because there was no trial, they didn't get the money back. Is that what that?
Yeah, I mean, you got to think this through. And I think there's actually a lot of conspiracies that people think that this was never going to go to trial, for instance, or it was always the plan to plea. And I mean, I'd have to defer to you. I mean, we knew for a very short period how quickly that turned around and a plea deal was reached, but everyone was gearing up for trial. The prosecution, members of Idaho State Police, because they were going to have to be experts for the prosecution and then cross-examined
Right.
by the defense. And both, and I imagine the defense did too. I just don't know those numbers or those specifics, but the prosecution reserved a house. And in fact, they may have reserved two. And so when it moved, it created all these travel costs and lodging costs for the prosecution. And they were planning accordingly. And one of the identifiable numbers from Latah County Prosecutor's Office was they had reserved this space, and for whatever reason, it was non-refundable. So they lost all that money. Idaho State Police, in their booking, I think also an Airbnb, they were going to put out about $40,000, and
Yeah.
for
Wow.
a house in Boise. They just happened to be in a situation where they got all but about $1,400 back.
Lost over $16,000 on a non-refundable lodging reservation booked for a trial that evaporated days before it started. Small line items next to the headline number, but each one tells the same underlying story, a system built around the assumption of a trial, paying full price for an ending that never arrived. Here's the irony at the center of all of it. Researchers studying neighboring states with capital punishment have found that death penalty prosecutions typically cost at least $1 million more than non-capital cases. And that's before factoring in the decades of appeals that often follow a conviction. Idaho currently has a man on death row from a case nearly 50 years old, with costs anecdotally estimated in the tens of millions over time. Kohberger's plea was supposed to be the fiscally responsible alternative to that nightmare scenario. Instead, the public got an $8 million bill, a guilty plea, 0 appeals, and a sealed file standing between taxpayers and the one thing they're owed, the receipt. Public money demands public answers, third time. Remember that phrase, because it's the only sentence in this entire story that isn't in dispute. If you want to look at the primary source yourself, search the public docket for the Idaho Supreme Court case stemming from the Latah County Resource Judge proceedings.
Yes. So I'll take you back to the beginning.
Okay.
So people will recall that Judge John Judge was the judge who was supposed to oversee this trial, and that was up in Moscow in Latah County. He eventually made the decision to move the case, but back in January of 2023, in order to avoid any sort of conflict, he assigned another judge from that district elsewhere in North Idaho to basically manage decisions about the public money, the account that could be tapped by Kohberger's defense team. So these were all public funds. The Latah County, they set aside this extraordinary defense fund of $1 million per year, basically, is what that ended up being. And so they can't just carte blanche spend that money. They had to have somebody who's basically overseeing it. So John Judge appoints another judge. It's technically a civil case, which that even confuses me, but it's a separate sealed case that's totally unaffiliated, although it's attached. And so this judge was making decisions about what money could be spent on that. So
Yeah, I was going to ask you that earlier. So the judge, because I was wondering, like, could they just spend whatever they want? But it sounds like this judge was the one kind of overseeing that.
Created back in January of 2023 by a judge who needed some.
Actually filed a public records request with that court and asked specifically about that sealed case file. And they'd never seen anything like this. And they had to figure out, like, what do we do here? And so I'm basically asking the judge who was reviewing and making decisions and approvals for how the defense spent the money, hey, I'd like to open that case file. And he received it as an unsealing process, which is a thing. Is a process. You don't have to be a member of the media. You could be somebody who just wants to unseal a court file and they make a decision about that. Well, in filing for that, Ann Taylor opposed it. She objected to any of these being open with the understanding, and the argument was, well, this was always intended to be a sealed case file. That was her understanding, and they've used these in past cases, like the Daybell cases. There were case files like this that are sealed. And so she argued that it was attorney-client privileged. She argued that it had a lot of work product, which is a protected document in the state of Idaho, and I think in many other states, and you can use that to exempt certain records and public records requests. And so we basically were sitting in themselves sealed hearings with this judge. We have an attorney. It's not me making the argument, but we have an attorney representing us. And basically,
Idaho Statesman investigative reporter Kevin Fixler filed a public records request in December of 2025, asking the court to unseal that civil file, the one tracking every dollar spent on
making opposing arguments with Ann Taylor on behalf of Bryan Kohberger about whether or not these documents should ever be released. Her position is none of those records should be released. It was always understood to be a sealed file. We prevailed in that case. The judge ruled on our behalf. He did say some of these documents are clearly exempt. There are things like educational and medical records which would be protected, and other intimate details, things that just the public is not entitled to see about any defendant, let alone Bryan Kohberger. And so he invited Ann Taylor to object to specific documents as these things would be released, and we would get the case file. So again, we prevailed. Ann Taylor then, and this is the first time we've ever been able to reveal this because it was a sealed case file, but we had to get approvals just to even ensure like we can report about this now, right? Like we've won, and there are documents that are now public, so it is out for public digestion. All that to say, Ann Taylor continued to object and has now appealed the case to the Idaho Supreme Court for review of this ruling. The Idaho Supreme Court, this is a case of first impression because it's just so unique. It's not often that these sealed case files get open, but part of the argument is that there are appeals. There are things that could prohibit the release of this information. But in Kohberger's case, that's not the situation. It's
Right,
fully adjudicated. There are no appeals. And so this is kind of a residual consequence, sort of interestingly. And so the Idaho Supreme Court now will make the decision on whether or not and which documents from this sealed case file, which is now up for being unsealed, and whether or not we'll ever get to see all the details about what the attorneys made and what each of these experts made and how all the money was spent.
Taylor appealed that ruling straight to the Idaho Supreme Court, a case of first impression, meaning there's no precedent in the entire state for what happens next. The Supreme Court hasn't even scheduled oral arguments yet. So today, more than 8 months after sentencing, the public still doesn't have a clear accounting of where its own money went.
Right. And part of her argument was, well, even though he was an indigent defendant and the defense paid for by the public, if this were a private individual who were paying their own money, that we wouldn't be entitled to such a case file. And I don't disagree with that. But here's the sticking point. That's not this situation. And once you bring on public money, my position, it's an opinion at this point, but my position is once you start spending taxpayer money, the taxpayers have the right to understand how their money was spent.
The client isn't paying the bill. The public is. Here's the ticking clock question, because this is where a budget story turns into something closer to a thriller. If the public can't see how $5.5 million taxpayer dollars were spent on a case that's already over,